"Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the aircraft. This is a restricted area." The voice was young, sharp, and marinated in the kind of self-importance that only comes from a new uniform and a recently laminated ID badge. Mark Renshaw, the museum's newly minted director of operations, stood with his arms crossed, his posture a carefully constructed barricade of authority. He positioned himself between the old man and the plane, a silent, colossal ghost resting on the heat-shimmering tarmac. Douglas Baker didn't seem to hear him. At 89 years old, his hearing was selective, a skill honed not by age but by years of listening to things that truly mattered. The specific hum of two Pratt & Whitney radial engines, the crackle of a radio cutting through static, the whispered prayers of young men thousands of feet above a hostile world. All other noise was secondary. His gaze, pale blue and watery but still intensely focused, was fixed on the C-47 Skytrain. It sat there, huge and lifeless, its olive drab paint faded by decades of sun, its windows like vacant eyes. To Renshaw, it was asset number 34B, a multi-million-dollar centerpiece of the museum's new aviation wing. To Douglas, it was the Whispering Gale, and she was his. "Sir, did you hear me?" Renshaw took a step closer, his voice louder now, laced with impatience. A few grounds crew members, taking a break in the shade of a nearby hangar, paused their conversations and looked over. "This is not a public viewing area. The official unveiling is next Saturday. You can buy a ticket like everyone else." Douglas finally turned his head, a slow, deliberate movement. He leaned a little heavier on the simple wooden cane in his right hand. His eyes met Renshaw's, and for a moment the young director felt a strange, unnerving jolt, as if he were being assessed and found wanting by a power he couldn't comprehend. "I don't need a ticket," Douglas said, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "I have an invitation." He ran his free hand over the pocket of his simple windbreaker, as if feeling for a letter that wasn't there. Renshaw's lips tightened into a smirk. "An invitation. I handle all official invitations, and I can assure you, your name is not on my list. What is your name, anyway?" The question was a challenge, a demand for credentials he was certain the old man didn't possess. Douglas Baker. The name meant nothing to Renshaw. It was just a name. He pulled out his radio with a flourish. "Security, this is Renshaw at Hangar 4. We have an unauthorized civilian on the tarmac, refusing to cooperate. Looks like a transient, possibly confused. I may need an escort." He said it loud enough for the grounds crew to hear, establishing his dominance over the situation. The confrontation, which had begun as a simple dismissal, was now hardening into a public spectacle. A small tour group, meandering toward the main building, slowed and stopped, their curiosity piqued by the official-looking man with the radio and the solitary old figure who stood before the giant plane. Douglas seemed oblivious to the growing audience. He was having a silent conversation with the Skytrain. He saw the patch repairs on the portside fuselage just behind the cockpit, and his gnarled fingers twitched, remembering the flak that had torn through the thin aluminum skin over St. Lo. He saw the slight, almost imperceptible sag of the landing gear, and remembered the bone-jarring landings on makeshift airstrips carved out of French farmland. "License and registration," Renshaw said, his hand out, a parody of a traffic stop, or some form of identification. "Museum policy." Douglas sighed, a long, slow exhalation of breath. It seemed to take a monumental effort to pull his attention away from the Whispering Gale. He reached into his back pocket and retrieved a worn leather wallet, its seams frayed, its surface softened by a lifetime of use. He fumbled with it for a moment, his fingers not as nimble as they once were, before pulling out his state-issued driver's license. Renshaw snatched it from his hand. He glanced at it, then back at Douglas's face, a flicker of something, disappointment perhaps, crossing his features when the name and photo matched. He had clearly hoped for a simple case of a confused old man who had wandered off from a nursing home, a problem with a neat, tidy solution. This was just an old man who knew his own name. It was more annoying. "Okay, Douglas Baker," Renshaw said, drawing out the name mockingly. "You've had your little look. It's time to go. The heat out here isn't good for—" The condescension was as thick and suffocating as the humid air. He handed the license back, but as Douglas reached for it, Renshaw's eyes caught something else in the wallet. It was a faded, creased photograph, tucked behind a plastic sleeve yellowed with age. In the photo, a much younger Douglas, no more than 20, stood grinning with his arm around a C-47, the same Whispering Gale that loomed behind them now. "What's this? Souvenir from a past visit?" Renshaw asked, his tone dripping with false interest. He didn't wait for an answer. His gaze shifted to the lapel of Douglas's windbreaker, where a small, tarnished metal pin was affixed. It was a pair of wings, but not the clean, polished kind you'd buy in a gift shop. This one was old, its details worn smooth. "Let me guess," Renshaw said, pointing a finger at it. "You bought that in our gift shop, right? Trying to look the part." The world seemed to tilt for Douglas, the sun-baked tarmac falling away for a split second. The smell of oil and hot asphalt was replaced by the acrid stench of cordite and engine smoke. The distant hum of a commercial jet became the deafening roar of 100 radial engines struggling to gain altitude, each one packed with young men checking their parachute harnesses, their faces pale and grim in the dim green light of the fuselage. He felt the heavy yoke in his hands, bucking and vibrating as flak burst around the cockpit, peppering the wings with shrapnel. A voice, his co-pilot Johnny, was yelling something, but the sound was swallowed by an explosion that rocked the plane violently. He saw his own hand, young and steady, gripping the controls, and on the collar of his flight jacket the same tarnished pin, gleaming in the chaos. "For Valor above and beyond," the general had said, his voice gruff, pinning it on him in a muddy field that still smelled of battle. "For bringing them home when no one thought you could." The memory, a lightning-fast echo of a life lived in extremis, vanished as quickly as it came. He was back on the tarmac, an old man leaning on a cane, with a young bureaucrat mocking the very symbol of his survival. Douglas didn't say a word. He simply stared at Renshaw, his pale blue eyes suddenly as hard and cold as the stratosphere. The look was so intense, so full of a history that Renshaw could never fathom, that the young director actually took an involuntary step back. From the shade of the hangar, an old mechanic named Sal watched the entire exchange. Sal had worked at this airfield for 50 years, first for the military, now for the museum. He'd seen hotshot directors come and go. He'd seen veterans visit before, men who would stand for an hour staring at an old plane, their eyes a million miles away. But there was something different about this one. The way he stood, the way he looked at the C-47, it wasn't just remembrance, it was reunion. When Sal heard the name the old man had given Douglas Baker, it didn't ring a bell. But then as Renshaw continued his tirade, Sal saw Douglas's lips move. He wasn't speaking to Renshaw. He was speaking to the plane. The word was too quiet to carry all the way to the hangar. But Sal, a student of these old warbirds, could read it on his lips. Whispering Gale. Sal's blood ran cold. He knew that name. Every rivet counter and historian associated with the museum knew that name. It was the plane's legendary moniker, earned in the skies over Europe. It was famous. And the pilot who flew it, the pilot was a ghost, a hero from the files, presumed by many to be long gone. Sal's eyes widened. He looked from the defiant old man to the arrogant director who had just called for security. This was not a situation for museum guards. This was a matter of history, of honor. Sal fumbled for his old flip phone, his hands greasy from a morning spent working on a forklift. He didn't call the main office. He scrolled through his contacts to a number he had been given once, and told to use only in a true emergency. It was the private cell phone of General Frank Thompson, the retired four-star general who had personally bankrolled the C-47's multi-year restoration and its transport to the museum. He was the museum's biggest benefactor and the chairman of its board. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Thompson, General, it's Sal. Sal Petrovich, from the airfield," Sal said, his voice low and urgent, turning his back to the scene so he wouldn't be seen. "Sorry to bother you on your private line, sir, but you told me to call if anything was ever wrong." "What is it, Sal?" The general's voice was impatient. "It's the Skytrain, sir. The C-47. There's a man here, an old man, and that new director, Renshaw. He's about to have him thrown out. He thinks he's a vagrant. The airfield is a secure area, Sal. Renshaw is within his rights, even if he is an ass about it," Thompson said, his tone dismissive. "No, sir, you don't understand," Sal insisted, his voice rising with urgency. "The man, he called her by her name. He called her the Whispering Gale. I heard him. And General, his name is Douglas Baker." There was a profound silence on the other end of the line. For a full 5 seconds, the only sound was static. Sal thought the call might have dropped. Then General Thompson's voice came back, and it was completely transformed. The impatience was gone, replaced by a tone of stunned, absolute authority that could command armies. "Sal," the general said, his voice like cracking granite, "keep your eyes on him. Do not let him leave. Do not let that little tyrant Renshaw lay a single hand on him. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir. I'm on my way." The line went dead. Inside a sprawling oak-paneled study miles away, General Frank Thompson stood up from his leather chair so quickly it scraped against the hardwood floor. He was a man in his late 70s, but he moved with the contained energy of a coiled spring. "Helen," he bellowed, His aide, a woman who had worked for him for 30 years and had never once seen him this agitated, appeared at the door instantly. "Get me the Baker file," he commanded, pointing to a locked filing cabinet in the corner. "The Gale project file." Now, as she hurried to comply, he was already on his desk phone, punching in a number for the local Air Force base where he still held considerable sway. "This is General Thompson. I need a formal honor guard detail. 4 men, dress uniform, and I need them at the west gate of the Amelia Earhart Aviation Museum in 10 minutes. My car is already on its way to you. I will brook no delays. This is a matter of the highest priority." He hung up and turned to his aide, who was holding a thick file labeled C-4743, whispering Gale, historical dossier. He flipped it open, his hands scanning the pages, past restoration invoices and transport logistics, until he found the personnel records from the 439th Troop Carrier Group. And there it was, Baker, Douglas, Captain, Commanding Officer, followed by a list of missions that read like a history of the European theater. Normandy, Operation Market Garden, Bastogne, the Rhine. Attached was a copy of his citation for the Distinguished Flying Cross. "My God," the general whispered, his eyes wide. "He's alive." He slammed the file shut. "Get the car. Tell security at the museum to clear a path to the south tarmac. Tell them General Thompson is inbound." His only thought was of the hero on the tarmac, being harassed by a man who couldn't tell the difference between a legend and a liability. Back at the airfield, Renshaw's patience had evaporated completely. The arrival of 2 burly museum security guards, looking awkward and uncomfortable in their ill-fitting polyester uniforms, had emboldened him. The small crowd of onlookers had grown. The scene was now deeply embarrassing for him, a direct challenge to his authority. "This is your final chance, Mr. Baker," Renshaw announced, his voice ringing with theatrical finality. "You can walk off this tarmac under your own power, or my men will be happy to assist you. Given your apparent state of confusion, perhaps a call for a medical evaluation is in order. We have protocols for this sort of thing." The threat was the ultimate humiliation to suggest that this man, whose mind held memories of fire and sky, was senile. Douglas didn't even flinch. His gaze remained fixed on the C-47, as if in response to Renshaw's final ultimatum. He did the one thing the director could not tolerate. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, past Renshaw, his hand outstretched toward the aluminum skin of the aircraft he had once called home. That single step was an act of pure defiance. It broke the spell. "All right, that's it," Renshaw snapped. "Gentlemen, escort him out." The 2 guards exchanged a hesitant look. Harassing an old man in front of 30 people with camera phones wasn't exactly what they'd signed up for. But a direct order was a direct order. They moved forward slowly, their expressions apologetic, and then they all heard it. It wasn't the familiar whine of a distant jet or the rumble of a service vehicle. It was the distinct, urgent sound of multiple sirens, growing closer at an impossible speed. But these weren't police or ambulance sirens. They had a deeper, more official tone. Heads turned, searching for the source. A convoy of vehicles swept through the museum's main gate, bypassing the ticket booths and service roads, and headed straight onto the airfield. A black staff car with government plates led the way, flanked by 2 imposing SUVs, and followed by a military police vehicle, its lights flashing silently. The convoy moved with a disciplined purpose that screamed high command. It rolled to a stop 100 feet from the C-47, the tires crunching on the gravel edge of the tarmac. The crowd fell completely silent. Renshaw froze, his hand still pointing at Douglas. The security guards stopped in their tracks. Doors opened in unison. From the lead car, a tall, imposing figure in a full-dress uniform emerged. He wore the 4 stars of a full general on his shoulders, and his chest was a constellation of ribbons. It was General Frank Thompson. Behind him, 4 airmen in immaculate honor guard uniforms disembarked, their movements sharp and synchronized. They carried no weapons, but their presence was more intimidating than any gun. Renshaw's face went white. "General Thompson," he stammered, rushing forward. "I had no idea you were visiting today. We have a small situation here, a security matter, but it's all under control." General Thompson walked right past him as if he were a piece of furniture. His eyes, burning with an intensity that could melt steel, were locked on one person only, Douglas Baker. He marched across the tarmac, his honor guard falling into formation behind him. The only sounds were the crisp crunch of their boots on the ground and the collective held breath of the onlookers. The general came to a halt precisely 3 feet in front of Douglas. For a moment, the 2 old soldiers simply looked at each other. Then, with a motion as sharp and precise as a rifle shot, General Thompson brought his heels together and raised his hand in the most profound, respectful salute he had ever rendered in his life. "Captain Douglas Baker," the general's voice boomed across the silent airfield, a voice accustomed to being obeyed without question. "General Frank Thompson, United States Air Force." "It is an honor, sir." Douglas, leaning on his cane, slowly straightened his back. The stoop of age seemed to vanish. He raised his own wrinkled hand and gave a weak but dignified salute in return. A single tear traced a path through the weathered lines of his cheek. The general dropped his salute and turned to face the stunned crowd and the utterly terrified Mark Renshaw. He gestured toward Douglas. "For those of you who do not know," he began, his voice radiating power, "you are in the presence of an American hero. This man, Captain Douglas Baker, was the pilot of this very aircraft, the Whispering Gale, with the 439th Troop Carrier Group." He pointed to the C-47. "On the night of June 5, 1944, Captain Baker flew this plane over Normandy, dropping men from the 101st Airborne behind enemy lines hours before the beach landings. He flew it again during Operation Market Garden, through skies so thick with flak you could have walked on it. During the Battle of the Bulge, he and his crew flew dangerously low, unarmed, through snowstorms to resupply the besieged men at Bastogne, landing on fields that were little more than frozen mud." His voice grew louder, each word a hammer blow of vindication. "He flew more than 50 combat missions in this aircraft. He brought his crew home every single time, once landing with over 200 holes in the fuselage and one engine on fire." "The trinket on his jacket," the general said, his eyes now fixing on Renshaw with a glacial fury, "is the Distinguished Flying Cross, awarded for extraordinary heroism in aerial flight. This plane is not a museum piece because it's a C-47. It's a museum piece because it was his C-47. A wave of gasps and murmurs went through the crowd. Phones that had been recording the confrontation were now lowered out of a sudden deep sense of reverence. The security guards looked at the ground, their faces burning with shame. Renshaw's complexion had turned the color of wet cement. "You," the general said, taking a slow, menacing step toward the director. "You are the director of operations of a history museum, and you failed to recognize living history when it was standing 3 feet from your face. Your job is to honor this nation's heritage, not to accost it, not to threaten it with a medical evaluation. You looked at this man and saw a problem. I look at him and see the reason we have the freedom to stand on this ground today. We will be having a very long discussion about your future employment, Mr. Renshaw. A very long one." Renshaw could only stammer. I didn't know, that's the whole point." The general roared. "You didn't bother to find out." It was then that Douglas spoke. His voice was quiet, yet it carried with absolute clarity in the stunned silence. He placed a frail hand on the general's uniformed arm. "It's all right, Frank," he said, the use of the general's first name a stunning intimacy. "He's young, he sees policies and procedures. He sees the building, but he can't see the soul inside it yet. That takes time." Douglas turned his pale blue eyes on Renshaw. There was no anger in them, only a profound, weary wisdom. "The uniform doesn't make the soldier, son, and the title doesn't make the man. It's what's in the heart that counts. This old plane," he said, turning to pat the fuselage gently, "it's not just aluminum and wire. It has a memory. It remembers the boys it carried. It remembers the sky, and the fear, and the hope. You have to learn to listen for that." As he spoke of the plane's soul, another image flashed, sharp and clear. Not his memory this time, but the stories. A muddy airfield in Belgium, winter of 1944. A young, exhausted Captain Baker stands before his shot-up C-47. A grizzled colonel pins the Distinguished Flying Cross to his collar. "She took a beating, Captain," the colonel says, nodding at the plane. "But you didn't give up on her. You brought her and all your boys home." The young Baker just nods, too tired to speak, his hand resting on the tarnished pin, a silent promise made between a pilot and his plane. The general, his anger subsiding in the face of Douglas's grace, nodded slowly. He turned back to the hero. "Well, Captain," he said, his voice now gentle, "your chariot awaits. The ramp is a bit stiff, but I think she'll lower it for you. Shall we?" Douglas Baker smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that erased 50 years of weariness from his face. He nodded. With the general on one side and an honor guard airman on the other offering a steadying arm, he walked to the forward door of the C-47. At a nod from the general, the groundskeeper, Sal, who had been watching with tears in his eyes, hurried forward and manually lowered the ramp. Douglas stepped inside, into the familiar gloom of the fuselage, his hand running along the cold metal ribs of the plane's interior. He was home. In the weeks that followed, the story became local legend. The museum board, at the vehement insistence of General Thompson, issued a formal and public apology to Captain Baker. Mark Renshaw was not fired, but was subjected to a far greater humiliation. He was reassigned to the museum archives, a basement office with no windows, and tasked with digitizing personnel files from World War II. His first assignment was to create a comprehensive digital record for the entire 439th Troop Carrier Group. A new magnificent bronze plaque was installed in front of the Whispering Gale. It told the plane's story, and at its center was a large photo of a handsome, smiling young Captain Douglas Baker, with a detailed account of his service and heroism. One quiet Tuesday afternoon, Renshaw was on the main floor, his current duty being to polish the new plaque. He looked up and saw Douglas Baker sitting on a bench near the plane. He wasn't alone. He was surrounded by a rapt group of schoolchildren, telling them stories not of war and death but of friendship, of the French countryside seen from above, and of how a plane could have a personality. General Thompson stood nearby watching with a proud smile. Douglas looked up and his eyes met Renshaw's across the polished floor. For a long moment they just looked at each other. Then Renshaw, humbled and changed, gave a slow, deliberate nod of respect. Douglas Baker, a hero who had faced down enemy fire and bureaucratic ignorance with the same quiet dignity, nodded back. It was a simple gesture of forgiveness, a final lesson in grace. The cycle was complete. The soul of the museum was beginning to heal. Thank you for joining us for this veteran valor story. If you were moved by Captain Baker's incredible journey, please like this video, share it with others who appreciate true heroism, and subscribe for more stories of the brave men and women who served.